En ik wil u heel graag voorstellen aan Aristotelis. En hij gaat zijn verhaal vertellen. Veel plezier.
Welkom allemaal. We gaan het in het Engels doen, omdat vanwege ook de livestreaming, maar ook het feit dat er een aantal mensen niet echt vloeiend Nederlands spreken. Ik hoop dat dat geen probleem is. Yeah. I've very consciously chosen not to play music because I think the story I have to tell is actually much too long, and I try to make it in the 25 minutes so I'm getting. And I also think that the core of this story is how social politics can define the life of a person, and so to make people understand how important it is to live in a democracy and have the freedom to choose to play music and express yourself in that way. So my story starts actually long before I was born, and it has to do with my mother. It starts just after the capitulation of Greece from the Germans in the Second World War. My mother was back then 11 years old in 1941, and my mother comes from the island of Samos. Maybe you have heard this name in the last couple of years, referring to this fugitives drama that has been played there. It's needed to make something clear. At that time, the beginning of 20th century, and after the Russian Revolution in 17, there was a very strong left side in Greece, let's say a communist movement. Greece is a country that has been very long divided. The people were divided to wealthy aristocracy and to the working class that didn't have any opportunities of improving their lives in Greece, in the country. So already from since the end of the 19th century, there is a very strong diaspora, Greeks leaving Greece for America or Australia to seek another future, a better future. My grandfather, my mother's father, Fokion, son of the teacher of the village on Samos, was a member of the Communist Party. So in the situation where Samos is occupied by the Italian forces, he is wanted to either spend the rest of the war, or for how much he knew, the rest of his life in prison, or to be executed. And there are a few other people in the same, facing the same consequences on the island, so they decide to escape. And they cut the trees themselves and made a boat, which they painted black, because the escape had to be at night, so they would not be seen. And then they have chosen the backside of a huge mountain, 1,400 meters, that is on Samos, to have to cross the least distance to Turkey, because this was the escape route. It's exactly the same escape route that people coming from Syria or Afghanistan or the other countries that are being suppressed right now are making. So it's the opposite route. So on a very dark night in the spring of 1941, there were 40 people, mostly women and children, and like 6 or 7 men between them, that made this trip. And there was this moment that they are crossing the last watchtower of the Italian Guard, and they would have to be very silent, because of course automatic weapons were placed there, and if they would make any sound, they could be just dead or drowned. What happened was they were all very silent, but there was a noise that didn't came from their boat, and suddenly the Italian guards started shooting in the dark, but happily they didn't hit the boat and they escaped. They traveled the whole night. The next afternoon, because they didn't have a motor on their boat, they were just manually trying to cross the distance to Turkey. They arrived on the beach near the small city of Kusadasi, and Turkish guards came to them, and after they had contact with the Coast Guard in Izmir, they decided that they were not allowed to stay, because Turkey had a very strange position between the Allies and the German-Italian acts. So they could not accept Greek refugees. So they sent them off. And of course this was a very strange moment, because the men knew if they would return to Samos, they would be probably executed. So they crossed from mainland Turkey to a rock island. There are like 12,000 of these small rocks that are like 100 or 200 square meters, and they are not inhabited. So they stopped there with the boat, trying to figure out what they would do. And the men started fighting with each other, because a couple of them wanted to go back to Samos, a couple of them wanted to wait until the night falls and cross again to Turkey. They stayed 2 days there, waiting, and finally a boat came from the Turkish coast, and the Greek consul was on that boat. And when he was younger, he had met my great-grandmother, who again deeper in the past played a role on the island, a political, social role on the island. And he personally arranged that all these 40 people went on the boat, went to Kusadasi, and applied for a permit to stay. The permit was not given, so then they traveled to Izmir, which is a bit to the north from where they crossed. And after 8 days in total in Turkey, they had to leave by train, and they went to Aleppo, which is why I believe history is repeating itself. They went to Aleppo, and there was a British camp in Aleppo where they were welcomed as allies, and they could stay there. They stayed there for 8 months. My mother was 11 years old, and she had malaria. She was suffering already a couple of months from malaria, and there she found the medicine that actually cured her in these 8 months. So that actually saved her life. After staying for 8 months in Aleppo, the situation in Asia and Africa became more dangerous, so they had to leave there. They crossed Lebanon by train and came to Egypt, to a place called Moses Springs, which is right at the Sinai mountain. They stayed there in a refugee camp for another 4 months, so we are already now longer than a year on the way. Finally, they boarded a Greek boat that went to Somalia, to Djibouti, and from there another train, and they reached Addis Ababa, which is the capital of Ethiopia. In Ethiopia there was a emperor, Haile Selassie, who welcomed the Greeks because they were Christian, Orthodox Christian, and that was also very broadly the religion in Ethiopia. There was a Greek community in Ethiopia. There was a Greek school, so they stayed there and they were very happy actually. They didn't even have to speak another language. They could just speak Greek with a Greek minority. My mother and my grandma stayed there until the end of the war. My grandfather stayed there for the rest of his life because he would not. Actually, he didn't believe that Greece was ready for a democratic change. He didn't see that the end of the war meant a better future for him and people that believed, let's say, in a socialist or communist vision. So finally he stayed there the rest of his days. Later on in the 80s, another son of his came to meet us in Athens from another Ethiopian mother, which was very funny to see how a family expands without people knowing about it, me knowing about it. My mother believed in a better future in Greece, so she returned. She did exactly the same trip back, and finally she got back to Samos to witness the Greek Civil War. After the end of World War II, the winners, Stalin and Churchill and Eisenhower, they met in Yalta in the famous conference. They divided the world in spheres of influence, and Greece was then put under British influence because it was too much a strategic place to just take their own decisions about which side they would like to go. There were 3 partisan armies fighting the Germans during the occupation, hiding in the mountains. One was a monarchist army, one was a Republican army, and the third one was a communist army. The Republican and communist armies didn't accept to give in their weapons, so they stayed in the mountains waiting for free elections that never came. And at that time riots began that led to a civil war that was very bloody, and actually this was the epicentrum of the beginning of the Cold War after World War II. After this period, in order for Greece to stay under the Western influence, there were a number of dictatorships and extreme right party, extreme right wing governments. The Communist Party was banned, and people were put in exile and imprisoned. And that's expanded up to 1964. And in 1964 there is the first election that a party that is more centered in the center got elected, and actually the winner was Georgios Papandreou, the father of Andreas Papandreou, very famous Greek politician in the 80s. He immediately took measures to make Greece a democratic country. So he gave amnesty to all the people in the prisons and brought the people from that were exiled on islands back to the mainland, which of course was seen as a really dangerous move from the monarchists and aristocratic powers. My parents were up to then, they had a life, but of course they didn't have a free life. They were followed and they were watched after by, to say spies is too much, but the stories about also the Eastern Bloc and the military police and the intelligence forces watching over the civilians. Well, that was happening in Greece as well, only from the other side. So when '64 a break of democracy came, they decided to have me. So I'm actually a child of democracy. My brother was already 9 years older when I was born in '66, and there was hope for a better future in the country, and all seemed to go well until the 21st of April of 1967, where the coup by the colonels, the colonels, Georgios Papadopoulos. It's so strange. I still can hear his voice. Right now, I can hear his voice in my head when he was talking in the radio, saying that Greece was a sick country that had to be operated on. At the moment they came to power, my father was not anymore a member of the Communist Party because he had a lot of doubts about how things were going in the Soviet Union. And actually it was the women in our family that were still very active. My mother, Baso, and my aunt, Cleopatra. They were members of a national parents commission that was trying to renew the Greek language. The official Greek language was a dead language between ancient Greek and modern Greek, but nobody on the streets was speaking. So that was seen as a major danger by the military government. And all these people that were involved in this movement were arrested and sent to prison. So I was like 11 months when my mother was sent to prison for 2.5 years. And I don't remember it, but I have very strongly believe it had a very strong sense of my emotional world, of who I am. Of course, I remember the feeling of people looking, behind your shoulder, and that my parents always said that I shouldn't talk too much with my schoolmates about what was the discussion at home. But my strongest remembrance is actually when the riots started to happen that made an end to this dictatorship. Was a students' riot at the Polytechnic School in Athens in November '73. My brother was back then 17 years old and was involved in these movements. And on the night that tanks actually rode over the gate of the school and just opened fire to the students, my brother was not at home, and we were all very worried because we didn't know where he was, and we didn't have mobile phones at that time. Well, he was not in there, so he was safe. This was a beginning of the end. The end, by the way, is the summer of '74, the war with Cyprus. One thing that is very strange to an 8-year-old boy that knows that his father might go to fight on a war he doesn't understand. And of course I remember that summer because some neighbors had a TV, and I watched my first World Cup with this wonderful Dutch team of Johan Cruyff, which was my first love for the Netherlands. All these long-haired, beautiful people, just
so free and so beautiful and playing this amazing football. And I had to cry like a baby when they lost the final to the stupid Germans. But anyway. So this is my first experience, my first remembrance of Holland and the beginning of the free life. Because after a couple of months, the colonels resigned and the first democratic government came to Greece. After 4 years, there were free elections, and there was a new wind in the country. In this new situation, I started playing music. I started with classical guitar, but after a year I couldn't stand that anymore because I wanted actually to play the bass guitar and form a band with a group with my friends, play blues and rock and roll, which was actually very new to the Greek culture. It was not forbidden, but it was not very popular. So that was my my first contact with music. My best friend, Nikos, he's my best friend in Greece still today. A pianist. He was playing in this rock and roll band. He was going to the Athens Conservatory from the age of 6 because his communist father was believing in the strong Russian Soviet approach of putting a child to an iron discipline right from the beginning. He invited me to the Athens Conservatory when we were like 14, 15 to see the double bass class because he wanted to start a jazz quartet with me when we would finish school. And there was, of course, no place in Athens where you could study jazz double bass at that time. So I went to the Athens Conservatory, and then another magical moment of my life happened. We went to the class of double bass. He opened the door, and there was a student. I think he was just tuning the instrument, actually, just playing the E string, a low, very low, full sound coming out of the bass when the door opened. And I just was flabbergasted, like, oh my God, this is what I want to do. So I went to the Athens Conservatory. The funny thing is, in the end, my love for blues and rock and light music influenced my friend Nikos that much that today he earned his living as a light music pianist in Athens. And his love for the classical music influenced my life so much that I'm now a classical bass player in the Netherlands. So you can say that a career switch came between us. My way of finding out what actually I wanted to do with my life was actually this Athens Conservatory. When I got a bit better, I got into the school orchestra, and then I heard for the first time all these new sounds of these fantastic instruments and all the colors. And this was, for me, the moment that I knew what I would like to do the rest of my life. I would like to be in the symphony orchestra and make and experience these sounds for the rest of my life. Then let's say the freedom and the democracy and the opening of the borders and exchanging of music and experiences with other European people. The funny thing is, the first teacher I had from abroad was also somebody that came from the Iron Curtain, a Bulgarian legendary teacher from Sofia Conservatory, Todor Tosev. He changed my playing in a week. And after that, I was very hungry to see what was happening outside the country. I made a trip to Avignon, to a major double bass masterclass, meeting huge names like Thomas Martin, Jean-Marc Rollet, and Franco Petracchi, who actually made a major European, let's say, renaissance of the double bass playing. And that made me hungry to go and study abroad, and brought me to Holland. We came together with my wife, Irene, that is also a musician. She plays viola. We came to study. Then she didn't find exactly what she was seeking for, and she left after 4 months to go to Austria. So we had a period of studying that I was living in Rotterdam and she was living in Graz, and we were seeing each other every 2 or 3 months. That strong was our love for music and for really getting the way of playing, the sound we would dream of. Later on, we started working in the Netherlands, so she moved here. And at that time, I was declared disobedient for the Greek army, because studying music for the Greek state didn't exist. It was just a hobby. There was no grade of education given to musical studies. So my stipendium was finished, was stopped, and I couldn't visit Greece for 6 years. In that time, I rounded up my studies in the Netherlands and won my job, the job I still have, in the Gelders Orchestra, in the Army Philharmonic Orchestra, which made me very happy, but of course I was missing home very much. So when I became a Dutch citizen in 2000, this was a real liberation for me. I could go and visit back home again. And I want to end my story by saying I'm not anymore the Greek I was when I came here. And I also am not totally Dutch, because, you know, for my friends here, I'm the Greek friend. And for my family and friends in Greece, I'm the Hollander. Which liberates me and makes me a European citizen or a world citizen, which was the dream of my mother for me and my brother. And I think actually to be able to have not just one nationality or one fatherland, it's enriching and liberating, because it makes you able to make your own choices and become a free person. Thank you very much. Net op tijd.
Wanneer mag ik u deze aanbieden?
Als jullie het leuk vinden, beneden staat zijn hand. Inmiddels kan je de grote zaal om zijn verhaal te gaan vertellen. Dus als je het leuk vindt, kom daar. Zoals het leuk om na te banden met Aristotelis mag natuurlijk ook. Ik vind het altijd ongeveer 3 minuten.